Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year, but the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Granville, Ohio, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
I suppose the story starts in the summer of 2013 and being madly in love and a little bit reckless and a little bit self-righteous in what I thought was my relationship with my body. I felt very certain and very sure that I knew exactly when, where, and how I ovulated, and was very humbled to find out otherwise. So I had successfully, but I guess we had successfully been using kind of, I guess what is called the rhythm method, and avoiding lovemaking around the times when I would be ovulating, which was always consistently around the full moon. So, and that worked for a while. And then it didn't. It stopped working. And I was very much in denial about it. I was very busy. I was traveling a lot that summer out of the country and came back to the States, came back to Arizona, back to Tucson, just to collect my things and be off to midwifery school. And I took a pregnancy test approximately 24 hours before I was supposed to leave for midwifery school. And it was quite positive. And the irony of it was not lost on me at the time. I remember crying and laughing all at the same time about how ridiculous the situation was. And really kind of how fucked up. But it was very poetic. Here I was, grown and seemingly responsible, and I had a Prius half-packed to leave for Texas, and freshly pregnant and unable to procure a swift abortion in either of those states. And I'm a birth worker. And it was a very challenging day. So I postponed my trip to Texas because I had a lot on my plate. Figured I might as well have postponed it another day. And after spending quite a lot of time on the phone with various Planned Parenthoods in and around the area and remembering precisely how oppressive and fucked up the entire process is, and doing research into the area in Texas that I was moving and realizing that all the abortion clinics had been shut down in that area in the recent months, and that was just precisely why I was embarking on this journey of reproductive justice anyway, I kind of just decided to do it myself. So I did. It wasn't quite that coherent or cognizant, but that was ultimately what was actualized. I had a really, really supportive partner at the time who insisted that I could do anything and everything that I wanted and would be okay no matter what I chose. Even offered to come with me to Texas if that was where I needed to have the abortion, and that ultimately did not end up happening. So I unpacked a lot of my midwifery books, looked up a lot of DIY herbal abortion protocols that I had. Realized as I was trying to cook things up in the kitchen that I really wasn't equipped with the herbal skills or with the herbal knowledge that I needed. And I also just didn't have, I think, the emotional stamina to do it by myself at that point. So I sought out help from a local herbalist and kind of told her my particular situation. And then I decided to go into ceremony. So I shortly after starting the herbal regimen, I spent 4 hours in a temazcal with my indigenous community, really meditating on the whole process. And mind you, knowing full well that a temazcal is contraindicated in early pregnancy, specifically because it raises basal body temperature to such an extreme. And within hours of exiting that temazcal, I began cramping and bleeding and stopped being pregnant. And it was really powerful and really beautiful, and all of it felt tremendously impactful and informed my subsequent midwifery training tremendously. I felt very appreciative of the humbling nature of that experience, and of how much it forced me to reflect on my relationship with my body, my sexuality, my geography, my community, my spirituality, my cosmologies, all of those things. And yeah, I think it was, I'm really grateful for having had that, as painful and sorrowful and beautiful all together at once. It was complex and amazing. Yeah. So that's what happened. And then I got pregnant again. Because apparently I realized that I actually really did want to be pregnant after all. Anyway, that's another story.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah, I don't think that I started driving to Texas within hours of starting to bleed. Like, it was like, okay, now I can drive to Texas. So it was a little bit ridiculous. So I drove 4 hours in the car bleeding and got there. And I think in a lot of ways just really didn't take the time to emotionally process what had gone down. I was on a time frame. I was about to start midwifery school. I needed to find housing. I needed to do all these different things. And so rather than honor whatever was going on with my body, taking even just a day to sit and be still and hold space for this really monumental thing that had just occurred, I kind of just was very businesslike about things. And I guess the way that I make sense of it in hindsight is that was my error. It wasn't so much, it was not taking the time to honor what had happened. And because I didn't do that, the experience wasn't, I don't feel like I fully integrated. I didn't have time to fully integrate it. I didn't do it. And I basically drove to Texas and started walking around within days. Because I was bleeding for quite some time, looking for housing and trying to secure that and trying to figure out the logistical aspects of moving to a new state and beginning a new program. And didn't take the time to journal, didn't take the time to meditate, wasn't with a community, didn't know how to have people to process it with necessarily. And so by the next cycle, I was like, well, actually, I don't regret that, but I'd really like to be pregnant again. And that was kind of what I came to. Probably irresponsibly. I imagine that, the way that I understand bodies and, or at least my body, is that, if you don't integrate a loss that way, you're going to kind of want to fill that loss with something else. And that's definitely what I try to do. So, yeah, I got pregnant again. Probably the next, I don't know, maybe just even the next month later. Same FOB, same father of the baby. A lot more intentional this time. Not so much a beautiful, reckless, love-making conception, but a lot more of a okay, so this is a thing that will likely happen. I'm pretty fertile, it turns out. And if it doesn't happen, that's okay. And if it does, I'm down. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I miscarried several months later. So, and it wasn't until that experience that I felt like I was able to come full circle and recognize that the two pregnancies were not at all unrelated, even though that's how I had made sense of it in my head. But that in order to come to terms with the miscarriage, I really needed to come to terms with the abortion, and that they weren't distinct, and that they were very much connected, and that I really needed to come to terms with all of those things and integrate them together. So, yeah. Well, the first time I remember very specifically, I know exactly when it happened. I was traveling internationally, and I had very specifically scheduled my plane ticket to coincide with 2 to 3 days post-ovulation so that I would not come home and immediately make love to the partner that I was hoping. Like, this was how I had rationalized my travel plans. I even remember ovulating while I was on my trip and being like, oh, thank God I'm on this trip right now and not with him. And so when I got home, after not seeing him for several weeks, it's monsoon season in high summer in Tucson, Arizona. It's maybe one of the most beautiful times of the year. I'm talking the sky itself is orgasming all over the desert. It's just the lightning and the thunder and the way the air is electric and humid. It's absolutely a magical time. And we hadn't seen each other in a while, and I was about to leave. I was about to move away, and we took it upon ourselves to revel and celebrate in the beauty of high summer. And it's been probably one of the most magical lovemaking nights for hours on end together in the desert under a monsoon sky. And so later on, a couple weeks later, when I realized why I was emoting and feeling and behaving in certain ways, it totally made sense. And I looked back on that night and I was like, oh, totally. Yeah, definitely. That was the night. And it wasn't even several weeks later. That's when I dealt with my dissonance and became cognizant of what my body had been telling me for several weeks. Because it was pretty much almost immediate. I mean, probably within 24 hours, I felt like there was something different. And I think that's basically what women talk about when they talk about knowing exactly when they conceived. And absolutely. And I remember being really pissed off later but I counted, and it wasn't the full moon and yada, yada, yada. And basically came to understand that, like, bodies don't always follow science rules. We're not machines. And there are definitely moments and at times when certain feelings and activities can totally just trigger a secondary ovulation. That's not out of the realm of normal physiology. And so, yeah. I mean, he and I talked about it later. We both understood that day to be really special in terms of our connection and our lovemaking. And so that also informed a little bit of my mixed feelings about wanting to have the abortion, because I definitely felt like I was kind of flipping my finger off at divinity a little bit. Like this is what love can create, and you're like, it's really not convenient on my time schedule right now, so no thank you, little miracle. And that's not actually how I feel about it at all anymore. I feel like lives come in and out of you and spend the time that they need to in order to teach things, and I learned what I needed to learn, and even if that was only a several week long pregnancy, I still feel very grateful for the temporariness of that life. It's still impacting me. I still very much feel the effects of having housed that life, however briefly. And I don't feel negatively about it. Like, I don't feel like it was a discarding at all whatsoever. I felt it was a very mutual, like, I'm coming in and now I'm coming out. We both agreed that this is not the right timing right now. And so, yes, there's a loss, and yes, there's some grief involved, but it did feel mutual. It didn't feel like it was me evicting somebody. It was like a mutual parting of ways. And so, yeah, that was definitely the first time that summer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about the difficulty in finding an abortion provider?
Oh, yeah. That was ridiculously infuriating and comical. So basically, within minutes of getting this positive pregnancy test, I was on the phone with Planned Parenthood, and I was just like, I very much felt like that, what is it, that movie where she's like, I'd like to procure a swift abortion, please, like on her phone. And it's not that I'm not ignorant to Arizona state law. Arizona is one of the worst states for providing respectful care, gynecological care to women. And I knew all of that. And at the same time, I personally had not had to deal with the bureaucratic process of it. And so I remember crying and laughing on the phone, just being like, oh, of course. No, this is actually why you need to do reproductive justice work, because this is a reality for so many women. And here you are, and you have all these various options, and you know how to navigate bureaucratic systems and have access to healthcare and insurance, and you still can't figure out how to get what you need from this. So yeah, it was like they were telling me, you know, we can get you in at the end of the week, but that's just for your preliminary appointment. Then you have to come back in a couple of days for an ultrasound to verify this, and then you have to come back for a third time to actually get the abortion. I was just like, you don't understand, I have to leave tomorrow for Texas, which is a worse state to get an abortion in. And so it was a really, again, very humbling firsthand experience of what so many women have to go through, and all the hoops that women have to jump through, and all the hassles that we have to go through, all the degradation that we have to go through, and all the humiliation that we have to go through just to get this one very simple procedure accomplished. And that's kind of where I was just like, I'm on a time schedule out here. I don't have the emotional energy, I have time scarcity. I don't want to deal with this. I really don't want to. And I don't feel like putting myself through a system that's going to demean me every step of the way. Fuck that. And so that at that point, that's when I recognized like how much privilege I have, that I had the option to opt out of needing to go the mainstream route. And again, that's also why I wanted to, another point of magnifying why I wanted to go to midwifery school, in order to be able to provide alternative options for women. Mind you, off the record, midwives are not, maybe not off the record, officially, women midwives not supposed to be providing abortions for women. But for me, this was another example of like why I needed to be in control of myself, because I can't trust anybody else to have my back. Not any institution, not any state, not any clinic. If I want to get things done with my body, if I want things to go down my way, I need to be able to do them myself and offer that to my daughters, if I ever have those, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it was a really perfect example of why autonomy and self and is so important for women, and why we have to know how to do things ourselves, basically, because no one's really going to help us out. Ever. And I'd watched too many sisters go through abortions to want to continue participating in that system. So, yeah. Arizona's not really a fun place to try and get an abortion in. Definitely not. Neither is Texas.
So exactly what did you do to do the abortion?
Herbs and temazcal. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you just went to an herbalist then?
She was a friend of mine. It was the whole scenario was really really serendipitous. So I was freaking out in the kitchen, in my ex's kitchen, mind you, because I had given up my apartment because I was moving. Also super awkward because it was my ex who knew before the partner did. Reading manuals, doing things. I psyched myself out. I didn't at that point, my herbalism knowledge was so limited that I knew more theory than I knew practice. And so I didn't really know dosage. I didn't know what was healthy for my body. I didn't know the time frames, and I psyched myself out, and I freaked out, and I was crying. And I was just like, fuck this. I need to go to yoga and take a chill pill. Figure out what I need to do after a little bit of asana and shavasana. And so I did. I left all my herbalism stuff in the kitchen and went to yoga and walked into yoga and saw my herbalist friend. And I was like, oh, okay, universe has my back a little bit. I need to talk to you. And at that point, I was still moderately in denial. I was just like, look, I'm really late. I don't really know what's happening. Can you help me out? And she's just like, are you pregnant? And I was like, probably. And she's like, okay, well, you need to go take a pregnancy test and we need to figure this out. So it was this whole roundabout thing. I did it. I took the test. First one was inconclusive, which I thought was just like the universe fucking with me. And then it was positive, and I ended up going over to her house. I mean, she's just like a hippy dippy herbalist lady. She like did a reading, like pulled runes and cards and made me like sit down and process my feelings on the matter. And it was lovely. It was very lovely. And she gave me herbs that she had made herself, from like wild harvested, and kind of gave me instructions on how to take them and told me to keep checking in with her. And so I was doing that, and then the way that I understand my body's response, though, is that it really was not the herbs. They weren't in my system long enough for the herbs to have really taken effect. And having attempted to help other women later with herbal abortions, and having had so much more experience with herbs and herbal abortions and herbal abortion protocol, there really is no way for the herbs to have taken effect that swiftly, because basically it was really the temazcal. And I don't know how familiar you are with temazcals, but basically it's a sweat lodge. And so I went in, and I participated with my indigenous community in a lot of temazcals. And they're traditionally, this is a Mexica community, but they're traditionally Mayan in origin, and the purpose of them is to train women for childbirth. They're difficult. They're physically, mentally, emotionally, physiologically a very difficult experience. You go into a sweat lodge and stay there without water in the dark and endure for hours and hours, however long. It induces an altered state of consciousness and is purging for the body, and kind of like mimics the process of, like, ultimately towards the end, like transition for a woman in labor. And so it's a mental discipline and also a physical discipline to get through this. And they are contraindicated. I mean, the way that hot tubs and other kinds of high temperature situations are contraindicated in first trimester pregnancies, because we know that increasing a woman's basal body temperature can induce spontaneous abortion. And that's basically what the temazcal did. And which for me was really peaceful, because I recognized that in the hours that I spent at temazcal, that's when I really came to terms with the situation. And I became a lot more at peace with whatever outcome was going to happen. And kind of came to peace with not being a midwife for a while, if that's what needed to happen. And ultimately, my body decided otherwise. And so within hours of leaving the temazcal, I began cramping and bleeding. And so it was less the herbs and more the heat that induced the abortion itself. So, yeah, I don't necessarily recommend it for everyone. I think I was definitely earlier along, and the pregnancy was probably less established, and therefore became a lot easier for it to release in that way. like, it's not going to be the same for everyone, and I don't necessarily recommend that as a mode of trying to induce one's own abortion, but that is definitely what works for me. So for me, the way that I realized that I hadn't come to terms, there was no full circle. There wasn't closure. I hadn't accomplished any closure. So I'd had this really beautiful, amazing ceremonial experience, and then I pieced out and behaved in a very, like, business-like way. So there was this, I think, like I didn't close the ceremony, basically, is how I understand it spiritually. And so I had to do that with the miscarriage. I had a really traumatic miscarriage. It was, like, way worse than the abortion itself. Well, I was in midwifery school at the time, and pretty deep into it, several months in, and absolutely exhausted because I was working 24-hour shifts, yada yada yada. And probably because I was used to doing so much on my own, and that I'd handled the previous abortion by myself and on my own, I somehow felt like I could handle the miscarriage by myself and on my own, and that was really irresponsible of me, because I couldn't. I mean, I shouldn't have. I did, but I shouldn't have. And and this is how full circle it was. This is how ridiculously full circle it was. I drove to Texas bleeding, right? And mid-miscarriage, I drove back to Arizona bleeding. So, and I'm not totally bleeding. I was far enough along in the pregnancy that I basically, needed to go through a labor to release that pregnancy and that baby. And so I started hemorrhaging in the car on the I-10 and just kept driving, and ended up driving myself to a hospital after bleeding for 100 miles, and basically hemorrhaged out 900 cc's of blood, which is approximately a liter of blood, maybe like a fifth of my blood volume. So very much could have died in that process, and didn't, and declined a D&C at that point as well. I had retained placenta. There were a lot of things that I really don't recommend to the average woman to do, but I did them, and it was very scary. It was very scary, and I only felt like I could handle it because I had been in birth, and I had witnessed hemorrhage, and I had seen blood loss, and I felt like I knew my body well enough to know that my body could handle that kind of blood loss. Knowing what I know now with the much more vast birth experience that I have, I look back on my own hemorrhage and think, like, how dangerous it was that I made those decisions. But at the time, I was very lucid. There's a lucidity that happens in birth, from all the cocktail of hormones and endorphins that occurs. It's a very conscious, lucid, altered state of consciousness. And I don't know how to describe it in any other way, but I remember sitting there on the table in front of this OBGYN who was horrified and terrified and trying to rush me into the OR to scrape out my uterus. And I was just like, no, you are way more scared than I am. I trust my body. I'm going to get up and I'm going to leave. And first, I'm going to go empty my bladder because my uterus is not going to involute, and I'm not going to stop bleeding until I empty that, which is just basic birth physiology. If your bladder's full, your uterus is not going to clamp down. Anyway, so there were these moments, too, where I was midwifing myself. And, yeah. So anyway, I had a dead baby in a bunch of chucks on this table, and I told her to give me a bag, and so I picked up this bloody chucks and this bloody baby, and I put it in the bag, and I said, I'm going to go now. She tried to convince me to get an IV. I said, hell no. My logic is women of color are not safe in private Catholic hospitals. They put an IV in me, then I'm trapped, and then they can do whatever the fuck they want with me. And then if they want to rush me into the ER, they can. And I have absolutely no agency over my body. So I just said, no, I'll go drink 2 liters of water instead. And then instructed my friend to go gather herbs from the herb store, like shepherd's purse, etc., etc. Picked up the baby. They wheeled me out in the wheelchair. I really was not very good to be walking by myself at that point. And immediately called my indigenous community again and asked for a ceremony for burial for the baby. And so at that point, I was put in the care of an amazing indigenous midwife who really took care of me in the postpartum, and did a series of limpias, and gave me really healing herbs and teas to take, and gave instructions for care, and she really helped organize a ceremony for burial at that point, and was somewhat of a relationship counselor too, because I was having some relationship difficulties with the father of that baby, and she really encouraged his involvement in the burial, and ultimately burying that child and having a community collective ceremony for the end of that life provided so much closure and so much beauty, and that really helped me move forward without feeling like there was still something left and something open and something that I needed to fill. And mind you, there was still like a tremendous amount of healing and loss involved and so much grief work for months, but I didn't feel like it left things open in the same way that having the abortion without closure did. And so like bearing that baby helped me come to terms with the previous loss, and it all felt like one. I mean, there were 2 pregnancies and 2 very separate situations and 2 different losses, but that one ceremony helped me come to terms with all of them as kind of a unified thing. And there's a tremendous amount of privilege in that story too. I recognize that there are so many women. I mean, for me, it was a really huge lesson in how much I'm able to advocate for myself in a really scary medical setting. I remember leaving that place and being very proud of myself. Like, holy shit. There I had just lost 20% of my total blood volume. I just lost my baby, and I was still able to say no to this doctor who really knows better, supposedly knows better. He's an authority figure, right? Who I have been conditioned to acquiesce my agency to. And I didn't. And I took matters into my own hands. I did what I thought needed to be done, what I knew needed to be done, and I did it on my terms. And I took the fetus with me. And I don't think, like, I don't know what laws are like or what medical protocols are in a lot of places, but I know that I've heard of different women who have felt really sad that they couldn't take their babies with them, or that they were absconded with, or that they needed to do autopsies, or they needed to do all those things. And I remember having that fear in the moment, which is specifically why I put the baby in the bag and put it in my lap and was like, I'm going now. This is not your property, it's mine, and I'm leaving with it. And even just like the idea of being able to bury it on my own terms with my own community, like I think that that's pretty rare. We didn't really go through normal legal routes and ask permission for where we were going to bury her. It was just like, no, this is indigenous land, we are indigenous peoples, and we're not going to ask permission for our own ceremony. So that's what we're going to do. And so there were a lot of aspects of it that I recognize as really being pretty unique and rare. And I also encourage women to do that shit on their own. Fuck that. No, take your babies with you. You need to ask permission for that. Take your placentas with you too. You don't have to ask permission for that. You don't need to ask permission for the contents of your own body. No. And, side note, I did have retained placenta, which is generally not a very good thing. And I ended up passing it a week later. So you can also decline a D&C and not die. That's also like a thing that can happen. And I think most women are really frightened into that. There were a lot of scare tactics involved. Like the OBGYN was, really trying to scare the person who was with me about like the possibility of my dying if I didn't acquiesce this D&C, if I wanted to DIC, which is like a coagulation disorder that occurs when you've lost too much blood. I mean, yes, there are real risks, and I understand medical professionals needing to wanting to tell women about the risks of that, but also women survived miscarriages for many hundreds of thousands of years without surgical intervention. There are ways that we can handle these things without scraping out the contents of our uteruses with metal. And my decision at the time involved not wanting more violence occurring to my body. It was already a scary and traumatic enough experience. I didn't need the extra trauma of penetration from metal to be added to the list of things that I needed to heal from. So, yeah, I would encourage women to, well, I don't know, but remember that they can do things on their own and that doctors aren't the be-all end-all authority figures on our health. There are usually other options available. Yeah, I don't feel ashamed about any of those things, and so if we can add more diversity to the narratives, I'm all for that.
Do you share your experiences often?
I haven't really. I'm not close to it. It doesn't always come up. And I think I'm probably a little bit more reticent to share with folks because I don't feel like it fits or aligns with so many mainstream narratives of abortion. And usually when I'm holding space for someone's abortion story, it's a lot more somber than mine. And so I don't feel like it's necessarily the most contextually appropriate thing to be like, so I had this really awesome, beautiful abortion. So no, I don't necessarily talk about it frequently. Not because probably for the opposite reasons that most women don't. But I'm open to in moments where I feel like it's relevant or useful to talk about a counter narrative to what most narratives about abortion are. But yeah, I think this is probably the most in depth I've ever gone about it. Definitely. Definitely.
Do you share your miscarriage story very much?
Yeah, I think I'm probably more likely to share my miscarriage story more. But more so because, I mean, it altered the course of an entire year for me. It was really difficult it would be like, yeah, I mean, it still informs me. So, yeah, I mean, losing that pregnancy was was a huge part of my life for a minute. So, and I experienced that as much more of a loss than the other one. So, I think I'm probably more inclined to talk about it because there was a lot more healing to be had from that one than the other one. But it's all kind of one story, even though they're two, ultimately. And it's all made me a much better midwife. I feel really, really grateful for both of those pregnancies and both of those little lives. And wouldn't really have it any other way. I feel like they continue to inform me and make me a better person and a better healthcare provider. So I'm pretty grateful. Mm-hmm.
Why do you want to share your story?
I think I wanted to share my story because I feel like abortion gets a really bad rap, one. And I think it's important that we have more positive abortion stories out there. They don't all have to be traumatic and horrible and full of depression and sadness and remorse or things like that. I think there are ways in which abortion can be really powerful and really empowering and really beautiful. And for me, my abortion was really quite spiritual. And I don't necessarily, and I haven't heard very many narratives that depict abortion that way. And I also haven't heard very many narratives depicting non-clinical, non-medical, non-surgical abortions. And I do think it's important that women understand that there are other options out there. And they are maybe hard to find a little bit, but with enough research and enough know-how and enough self-education, we really can learn how to do these things for ourselves again. And it doesn't have to be scary, and it doesn't have to be back alley, and it doesn't have to be life-threatening. And in fact, it can be how we've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, which is with each other, with our sisters, with our mothers, with our aunts. We have the ability to give and take life, and that is a power that we have always had, and I think we can remember that. And I think it's important that women do remember that.
As always, for more information about the Abortion Diary podcast, visit us on the web at theabortiondiary.com or email me with your questions or comments. If you would like to share your story, send me an email at melissa@theabortiondiary.com or visit our website, click on Share Your Abortion Story, and fill out our contact form. If you're a fan of the podcast and would like to help us reach more folks, please subscribe on iTunes and write a review or rate this podcast. Your reviews and ratings will help us grow in the iTunes rankings and reach more people. I would also love to hear from you. You can also follow The Abortion Diary on Twitter or Facebook. And The Abortion Diary can't continue without your support. Support the Abortion Diary by making a tax-deductible donation to us on Fractured Atlas, or buying some of our wristbands or totes on Store Envy. And a special thanks to you for listening. I'll be back next week with a new story.